Afro-Argentines, as the black people in Argentina are popularly known, formed a significant part of the Argentine population in the 18th century. In the late 18th century, according to a census by its Spanish colonial masters, estimates suggested that nearly 30% of the population had African ancestry, which meant Afro-Argentines made up one-third of the population. By 1857, 79 years later, the black population had dropped to 15%. Today, Argentina is considered the whitest country in South America, with just 5% of the population identifying as Afro-Argentine during the 2010 census. As a matter of fact, their numbers have reduced drastically, and it would be near impossible to see Afro-Argentines in sports, journalism, politics, and so on. So, what led to the reduction and near eradication of Afro-Argentines in Argentina? What actually happened to black Argentinians is so disturbing and inhumane, it would be shocking that it wasn't being taught in classrooms if the world wasn't so inherently racist. Before we get right into the video, please smash the like button and subscribe to the channel to keep informed of our eye-opening black narrative. The history of Afro-Argentines dates back to the 16th century, when black people, chained on the feet, were brought from their homelands in Africa to be traded as slaves in Argentina. At the time, Buenos Aires, the capital city of Argentina, had just been founded, and trading was the main commercial activity. As the years went by, the number of slaves being traded in and out of Buenos Aires increased drastically. As of the 1600s, the slave trade industry had grown so much that about 70% of all trading in Buenos Aires involved importing slaves from Africa. It was only a matter of time before slave trading became a legalized trade in Argentina, extending far into the 1800s. Although the slave trade in Argentina ended in 1813, slavery itself lasted until 1853, before it was finally abolished. When one looks at Buenos Aires now, in its clothing of architectural and structural beauty, it is hard to imagine that it once was an ugly sight during the long years of the black slave trade and trafficking which increased the black population in the colony. Data recorded in the 1778 census carried out in Argentina by the then Spanish colonial masters showed that more than 30% of the people in Buenos Aires were black. By the time the slave trade ended in the 19th century, Afro-Argentines accounted for one-third of Argentina's population, even though many of them were descended from slaves, and some were still in slavery. Not only were the blacks a robust community, but the Afro-Argentines were also involved in and actively influenced the Argentine culture with their African ways. For instance, the popular tango musical style and dance, which was developed in Argentina, has its roots traced to the African country of Angola. Today, Argentina is considered the whitest country in South America, which is odd considering that, like Brazil, they were colonized and subjected to Spanish colonists shipping in African slaves from the west coast of the African continent. One thing is certain, black people did not just vanish from the historical accounts of Argentina. The Afro-Argentines were written out of it. The real question to be asked then is how? How was a whole racial population washed out of history? The disappearance of the black population occurred in different ways. Few were circumstantial, but some were intentional. These ways are different, yet when combined, give a well-rounded explanation of how Argentina erased its black people from history. These combined methods demonstrated acts under the umbrella of whitening. Whitening can simply be described as an act of reimagining a race towards whiteness. The rationale behind this act is that there exist some societal privileges that benefit white people compared to people of other races. By implication, it means that black people are of a race inferior to whites. Also, by extension, the ideology is backed by the belief that black people should be erased by the gradual loss of their black genes through marriages to whites and birthing children who, based on their whiter skin, will be closer to the white construct and standard. The Argentinian government subtly believed and acted out this ideology. However subtly they may have acted, it is evident today that Argentina has been whitewashed. The sudden and drastic disappearance of black Africans from Argentina is typically attributed to two factors. First is the war against Paraguay from 1865 to 1870, in which thousands of black people fought for the military, as well as various other wars. Deaths on the battlefield also led to a vast gender gap among the African population, leading black women and white men to bear children together and dilute the black population. Many black Argentines also fled to neighboring Brazil and Uruguay, which offered a somewhat more welcoming political climate. However, the death of blacks in wars goes back even further to the Argentinian War of Independence of 1810. In the early 19th century, Argentina gained independence from Spain and embarked on a path of nation-building. The new Argentine state sought to create a homogeneous society based on European ideals, where whiteness was perceived as the epitome of progress and civilization. As Argentina solidified its independence, waves of European immigrants flooded the country, contributing to the growth of its population. However, these new arrivals brought with them deeply ingrained racist beliefs that further intensified the already existing prejudice against black individuals. White supremacy and the belief in racial hierarchies began to take root in Argentine society, with black people becoming targets of discrimination and violence. Argentina's elites propagated the notion that the black population posed threats to the country's social order and stability. Racist stereotypes were disseminated, painting black individuals as uncivilized, intellectually inferior, and prone to criminality. These stereotypes were used to justify the exclusion and removal of black Argentines from mainstream society. Black communities, mainly concentrated in regions like Buenos Aires and nearby provinces, played significant roles in the country's development. They were involved in various sectors, including agriculture, domestic work, and commerce. However, the economic success of these communities became a perceived threat to the dominant white society. Fear of competition for jobs and economic resources fueled the desire to eradicate the black population from Argentina. A second devastating factor that led to the disappearance of the black populace was the outbreak of yellow fever in Buenos Aires in 1871, which killed swaths of the local population. Many sources, however, point to a far more sinister force that led to the near extinction of the black race in Argentina. The covert genocide perpetrated by Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, president of Argentina from 1868 to 1874, played a key role in decimating the Afro-Argentine population. Sarmiento was a staunch proponent of white European racial purity. Discussing the mixed-race Argentine cowboys known as gauchos, he stated that their only use was to serve as fertilizer when they died. Equally chilling, he wrote in his diary in 1848, "In the United States, 4 million are black, and within 20 years will be 8 million. What is to be done with such blacks, hated by the white race? Slavery is a parasite that the vegetation of English colonization has left attached to leafy tree of freedom." During his time in office, Sarmiento commenced a systematic erasure of African existence through a series of policy decisions that ultimately proved inimical to black life. He segregated the black community from European descendants, depriving them of tolerable infrastructure and health care, and thus effectively condemning them to die when cholera and yellow fever outbreaks swept through the city. He also forcibly recruited Afro-Argentines into the military, imprisoned them for crimes that were minor or entirely invented, and executed them en masse. By 1875, the toxic mix of repressive policies, disease outbreaks, and ongoing conflict had so depleted the black population that the government did not even bother to register African descendants in the national census. Today, black people have been erased not only physically, but also metaphorically from the country's consciousness and perceived history. Some Argentines even think that their country never trafficked in slaves at all, a mindset that Henry Louis Gates Jr., writing for The Root, calls cultural amnesia that finds the black presence in Argentina somehow inconvenient, something to be denied. Even Argentina's most precious cultural export, the tango, has been divorced from the historical background that ties it to black Argentines. This massive erasure of historical, physical, and cultural meaning is considered a victory by Argentine governmental leaders who have for many generations preferred to imagine the country as an all-white extension of Western Europe and Latin America. For the country's few existing Afro-Argentines, daily life is beset by racist acts on both the micro and macro levels. The term Negro is applied to anyone with slightly darker skin, regardless of whether they are descended from Africans, indigenous Indians, or Middle Eastern immigrants. Those with darker skin are commonly denied admission to nightclubs and are needlessly pulled over or questioned by the police. In school plays, the use of blackface remains common. On a broader scale, socioeconomic discrimination toward those of African and indigenous ancestry persist, leading to higher rates of poverty and illiteracy among minority groups. Politicians, for their part, have been of little help in mitigating racism and have in fact blatantly deployed racialized rhetoric to raise citizens' ardor regarding crime rates and give themselves an advantage in the polls. Besides general racial profiling, policemen have specifically begun to harass African street vendors in recent years, refusing to recognize their residency documents, bullying them for cash or free merchandise, and even stealing their items, with threats of arrest or violence upon resistance. Abuse against street vendors has reached a high enough pitch to attract the attention of various rights groups, thus shedding some measure of light on racism in Argentina. In June 2017, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Racial Discrimination expressed concerns about violence against African migrants and refugees, who they stated were routinely exposed to harassment and extortion by the police. And on June 20th of the next year, recognized across the globe as World Refugee Day, more than 20 human rights organizations came together to condemn the escalation of violence exercised by the state against Senegalese street vendors in Buenos Aires and demand the implementation of comprehensive solutions for the plight of the Senegalese community. But with institutionalized racism permeating all facets of Argentine society, it is unlikely that the Supreme Court will take action in favor of Afro-Argentines. The masked racial discrimination that has fed Argentina's erasure of its black history is astounding, and it has caused multiple reverberations for generations. While the lives of Afro-Argentines were lost, the black consciousness and black accounts were also lost to history. It is a painful reminder of the terrible consequences of discrimination and the loss of cultural diversity. In recent times, Afro-Argentines continue to fight to bring back and keep the black account in Argentine history by telling their stories. It is time to acknowledge and address this dark history, so we can work towards a more inclusive and fair Argentina, where everyone's contributions are celebrated and valued. As always, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share our videos to let more people know the truth about blacks and to hear their own part of the narratives. Thanks for watching.